Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific.
Hey Richard, welcome to another episode of Maritime Matters. We're recording this on Friday, I had to check the date, the 15th of November. Where has the year gone? What have you been up to?
I've been marking exams, all sorts of fun and games, and as I think we might touch on a bit later, following events particularly in the US and trying to think a little bit about what that might mean and realise how little we know about what that might mean. But that's been kind of what I've been up to. What have you've been jetting around again? What have you been up to?
I have. So I was lucky enough to be in the Philippines last week to attend the Manila Dialogue, looking at South China Sea issues, as you can imagine. I think it was a pretty good dialogue. It was also had significant academic representation actually from China, which I thought really added kind of some flavour to discussions about perspectives. And then this week I have been in Adelaide. The National Security College has been taking its executive courses on the road. So this week I was in Adelaide teaching about national security foundations and maritime security. I would recommend, if you are working in the APS, check out the executive courses. This is not an ad, they're not paying us, but they're pretty good. What's been happening in the region?
So I think the first thing we're going to talk briefly about is the Red Sea. So sort of the region, big picture region. We can have a debate about whether it's the region in a minute.
Send the ship.
We're coming up on 12 months from the kind of the sort of start of this the issue of the Houthi attacks and the seizure of the Galaxy Leader, which was on the 19th of November 2023. And I guess one of the things that sort of is worth highlighting is that actually this is still an issue. We don't hear very much about it, but it's having very significant impacts. So traffic through the Bab el-Mandab is down 70% on the year, with the majority of the shipping actually going the Cape of Good Hope route, so around the southern tip of Africa and up the Atlantic, rather than going through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. So this is having a huge range of impacts on shipping. I saw some quite interesting stuff yesterday about the additional pollution that's been created by shipping have to travel a lot further. It's even having things like impacts on Egypt and because of income from the Suez Canal. So lots and lots happening there. The other thing that's happened just this week was quite a remarkable attack by the Houthis on two US destroyers, the USS Sprucen and the USS Stockdale. They were engaged or had 8 UAVs, 5 anti-ship ballistic missiles, and 3 anti-ship cruise missiles fired at them by the Houthis. Now, as ever, the Houthis claimed that they sunk these ships. The Americans reported no injuries or damage. But just the fact that this is still going on at this point, and they are still engaging very high-end American surface combatants with a lot of kit. 8 UAVs, 5 anti-ship ballistic missiles. This is a significant kind of attack on American ships, which is in itself, well, up until a year ago, would have been extraordinary. And now it's kind of an everyday sort of occurrence. So I think it's worth just coming back to this and thinking about what a significant change it is. What are your takes on what's happening or what's not changed
Look, I think it's interesting in terms of the fact that the US have continued to conduct significant strikes against the Houthis. So we saw in October this year the US B-2s that either transited through or did something with Australian bases. What that something isn't entirely clear, but headed off and struck the Houthis, focused on hitting their underground bunkers that store some of their missiles, etc. Over the weekend, so just before this attack, there were more reports of strikes, US strikes using F-35s. I think it's the first time they've actually used F-35s to strike the Houthis. I have to double check that, but I think it is. And again, though, what we're seeing is despite these, and the US and the UK have hit the Houthis now a number of times in the last 12 months, they still have the capacity and the firepower to undertake these strikes. Now, they haven't been successful. They also did report, when they reported the attack on the two US DDGs, the Spruance and the Stockdale, the Houthis also reported that they'd attacked the carrier Abe Lincoln in the Gulf of Aden. Abe Lincoln, I think, is in the Gulf of Aden, but the US confirmed that she had not come under attack. Typical, Houthi misinformation. But I think, the 12-month anniversary is something that really should be noted in terms of the ability of this group, despite constant attacks from the US and the UK, to restrict freedom of manoeuvre through a key choke point. And, looking at some of the combined maritime forces in the last 12 months actually established a joint maritime information centre that looks specifically at the Houthi attacks, and they produce a weekly or every 2 weekly report that you can find on the internet. They're reporting that in the last 12 months, there's been 107 incidents reported, which includes things like suspicious approaches, hijackings, etc., but also attacks and attempted attacks on shipping. 4 mariners have been killed with 2 severely injured, which I think in terms of the numbers there, very sad in terms of the loss of life, but it is amazing that there has not been more significant loss of life given some of the barrages that have been fired at merchant shipping. And I think so there's some interesting lessons that we've spoken about before in terms of, in some ways, the resiliency of shipping and merchant shipping in the face of these attacks. And certainly we have managed to disband the view that was taken a couple of years ago that with the development of ballistic missiles that could target warships, that warships would not be able to defend themselves. Certainly we have learned that they can. So I think this has been a really important 12 months in terms of understanding trends in the maritime domain. Sadly, I don't think it's being resolved anytime soon. It's clear that even if the US continue to target the Houthis within Yemen, they're not going to knock out their capability, which is something the Saudis found also when they were involved in the civil war supporting the Yemeni government. And really, until there's a resolution in the wider Middle East challenges, this is not going to be resolved. So we're still going to see delays to shipping. And there has been a perception in Australia that the additional time it's taking, so the 14 days it's taking for ships to avoid the Red Sea, is not having an economic impact in Australia. It is. It certainly is adding to some of the inflationary pressures. In terms of how much, that hasn't exactly been measured. But initially when this started off, because there was an oversupply of container ships, this is what's been told to me anyway, during COVID, because everybody was investing in shipping, the impact has been reduced. But this is having an impact, and it's something we should pay attention to.
Absolutely. And that impact is potentially getting it worse if we see a tightening in shipping availability rates and that sort of thing. So significant impact. And I think this, as you say, there's some really interesting lessons to think about kind of the current dynamics in naval power, sea power, how effective ships are still at resisting lots of these kind of new carrier killer weapons and all sorts of other things that we've heard so much about. But at the same time, Nelson's old adage that a ship's a fool to fight a fort, there's still some truth in that. And actually, it's really hard for naval power to achieve results on land if you're not willing to commit forces or air power for that matter to back that up. So yeah, really interesting case study. But as you say, particularly the loss of life of the mariners and everything else, it's also feeds into a wider kind of sense that there's lots of things going on in the world and not a lot of them are great. But maybe that's just the fact that us national security type people always look at the glass half empty. Anyway,
Sounds
what else
like you
need
need a gratitude journal or something, Richard, to But what else has been happening? Well, speaking of, the theme, which really has been a key theme of the last 12 to 18 months now, which is the contested maritime domain. There's been a number of developments in the South China Sea, which I guess in some ways could loosely come under the idea of lawfare, which is the idea of using kind of those legal terms, international law, etc., trying to achieve or at least prove a point. We've seen the Philippines. In fact, last week when I was in the Philippines, they passed some new maritime laws, which China has reacted pretty strongly to. Two laws that they've effectively passed. One is the Maritime Zones Act, which aims to declare the rights and entitlements of the Philippines to establish a legal basis for social, economic, commercial, and other activities in areas. Effectively, it's just domestic legislation to really match international law in terms of what are the maritime zones that the Philippines claims, and where are they? And as much as China has said that this is quite aggressive from the Philippines, most countries have some degree of Maritime Zones Act. And, I know that Australia has our Seas and Submerged Lands Act from 1973 and a series of other acts where we articulate our maritime zones. So this is not really changing the dynamic in the region, but China has reacted pretty strongly, and we'll get into that a little bit. The second one was the Archipelagic Sea Lanes Act that was passed in the Philippines, and effectively, without geeking on about this, archipelagos really do need to designate where they see their archipelagic sea lanes. Of course, when it comes to a maritime law perspective, there are different passage regimes through archipelagic sea lanes, and effectively that is what the Philippines is doing. Other archipelagos have done the same. But China has reacted very strongly to it. So within about maybe 2 days, maybe 1 day, China came out and promulgated its baselines around Scarborough Shoal. Now, we've spoken about Scarborough Shoal in this podcast before. It is well within the Philippines exclusive economic zone. So Scarborough Shoal is 240 kilometres from the island of Palawan in the Philippines, which is about 129 nautical miles. So well within the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. It is under Chinese control. It was a significant flashpoint in 2012 that some thought might lead to a conflict at the time. But there was an agreement brokered by the US between China and the Philippines that both would withdraw their forces, and what happened is the Philippines withdrew theirs. And China did not withdraw theirs. Now China has had control of Scarborough Shoal for 12 years. Interestingly, they haven't militarized it, and there's a lot of view that China militarizing Scarborough Shoal might be seen as a red line. But this announcement in the last week is effectively China coming out and saying, this is how we draw our baselines around Scarborough Shoal. Baselines, again, from the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, which is effectively where you draw your territorial seas from, your exclusive economic zone from. Does this mean much? No, but it is back to that concept of trying to use these statements and this lawfare to try and push a point in the South China Sea. So also, I guess, on the theme of the South China Sea, we did see it was touted as the inaugural defence ministers meeting between Australia and the Philippines, which I thought was interesting because the defence ministers of Australia and the Philippines have met previously a number of times, I believe. But either way, I guess this is something they're trying to establish as a standard annual meeting, perhaps. Look, no significant announcements out of it, but I think it's important to highlight some of the words used in the statement because it shows the general theme of how important discussion around the maritime domain has become to a lot of these kind of international engagements. So from the statement, it says that they underscored the vital importance of all states being free to exercise rights and freedoms consistent with international law, as reflected in the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, including freedom of navigation and overflights, and other lawful uses of the sea. And then it goes on to kind of reinforce the 2016 Arbitral Tribunal. Not new, not significant, but I think, on the theme of maritime matters, which is the name of this podcast, we have seen this kind of transition in the last couple of years in terms of the maritime domain, the UN Convention on Law on the Sea, being almost a key statement piece in any defence talks that we have with another country. It's always included in the statement after the fact. And so I think that just Goes to show, I don't know, maritime matters. That sounds cringy. And then while we're talking about South China Sea, so we've talked about the fact that Philippines has passed some new maritime laws, which are pretty standard, to be honest. China's reacted significantly with establishing baselines around Scarborough Shoal, which is part of the Philippines EEZ. We've also seen this interesting development last weekend between Indonesia and China, which what's happened is not entirely clear. But of course, we spoke about this on the last podcast. So Indonesia's President Prabowo has been inaugurated. Within the first week of his inauguration, we saw China really pushing things in the North Natuna Sea in the way they hadn't for a little while, which is interrupting Indonesian surveying operations there with a Coast Guard vessel from China. They did it 3 times within the first week of his inauguration, clearly sending a message. So Prabowo has been in China in the last week, and there was an announcement in English, which also sends a message, not the native language of either of those countries, talking about a maritime agreement to do joint cooperation over overlapping maritime areas. Why this has raised a lot of concern is because Indonesia continues to assert, and rightfully so, they have no overlapping maritime areas with China. Of course, what we're talking about is China's claim to the 9-dash line and how that encompasses elements of the North Natuna Sea. But Indonesia, like most states, doesn't recognise China's 9-dash line. And so this was a little bit of a weird one. We saw within 24 hours the Foreign Affairs Department of Indonesia walking back on this, saying they hadn't changed their position at all. But certainly the wording of the statement, because the agreement's not been published, but the wording of the statement implied a tacit recognition of the 9-dash line and China having legitimate claims to the North Natuna Sea. So that was interesting as well.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting, even down to, and you'll know more about this than I do, but the phrase that the joint development and the idea of a joint development is something that is there is a specific concept that you can do joint development of or joint exploitation of resources in areas where you have not yet reached an agreement over sort of basically where you draw things like EZ lines. So the language seems to quite clearly point to the idea of there being these overlapping claims and that the acknowledgement on both sides that such things exist. And then you had the Indonesians walking back pretty rapidly from this. But I think there's some sort of real questions there, obviously from a kind of an Indonesian perspective about, I've seen some interesting discussion about kind of what does this say about the president's approach to foreign policy? To what degree was he sort of receiving all of the right kind of advice beforehand in order to sort of not necessarily walk into this? And those who are very much kind of Indonesian law of the sea and sort of regional experts have been suggesting that this is a pretty significant misstep. And I think was Evan Laxmana said that I think he said that you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Once you've kind of gone out and said something like this, it's very difficult to actually meaningfully walk back from it. So I thought that was a really interesting, as you say, pretty odd kind of development, frankly.
It is, and I think it shows pretty early to some of, stepping away from maritime for just a brief moment, but some of what had been thought as Prabowo's tendencies. Yeah. So Prabowo gave a pretty significant speech at Shangri-La in 2023, where the view was he went fairly significantly off-piece. So that there has been this view that Prabowo doesn't necessarily listen to the advice from his foreign affairs department, and this is probably the earliest example that we've seen since he's been inaugurated that there is a bit of a disconnect there.
Yeah, so I think that's definitely something to watch. Whereas from my reading, the kind of the Philippines thing fits in much more into a pattern that we know and kind of have almost come to expect now. The Philippines legislation has been in the pipeline for a while, so the Chinese were always likely to respond in some kind of way, and it fits into that sort of sense of a tit for tat. Not good, but not necessarily unexpected in the same kind of way. If moving on, thinking about what else has been happening in the region, I guess one of the obvious ones, and I'm now going to completely mangle the name, but significant exercise involving the ADF and TNI, the Armed Forces of Indonesia. Exercise Keris Wumura, which has involved about 2,000 ADF personnel, doing a range of different types of operations, including a big kind of amphibious assault type operation. I think Darwin. Adelaide was there as the LHD, the big assault ship. Darwin was kind of leading the sort of Australian maritime contingent. But I think it's interesting to see that the stepping up of defence ties with Indonesia. Obviously, these have had good times and bad times in the past, and at times, engagement with TNI has been challenging. But it seems that this is a sign, building on the recent defence cooperation agreement, that actually these connections are really developing. And I thought it was also interesting to see, from my reading, and it's obviously a little bit difficult to see precisely, but there seemed to be a shift away from the usual kind of HADR, more kind of constabulary type operations towards something that looks more like warfighting. And I thought that element of it was quite interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is a really important exercise. Now, often, I guess having worked in exercise planning, often I think that the announcements associated with exercises very much overstate the achievements, is a common trend. However, I think this one is really important, and I think that it's good that it's been highlighted. It has actually picked up some press in the national and international media, which is also good. The reason I say that is, one, the scale of it is, I'm pretty sure the reporting says it is, but I'm pretty sure it's actually true as well. This is the largest exercise that we've ever done with Indonesia in terms of the scale, certainly on a bilateral basis. And we have had a trend with a lot of our exercises in Southeast Asia moving them towards trilateral with the US, or multilateral. So this is quite significant, and also the complexities you highlight. There was some reporting that it was high-end maritime warfare. I wouldn't go that far. Certainly is a high-end amphibious exercise, which looks like a number of troops and a number of vehicles, including tanks, that are heading across the beach. I think it was great to see TNI personnel looks like some preparation training in Australia, and then embark in Adelaide and head across to Indonesia for the exercise. So I think that is all really, really, really positive. And your point about HADA, I think initially Keris Wumura, when it was announced as part of the Indo-Pacific Endeavour activity, I'm not sure what you call Indo-Pacific Endeavour this year, because it doesn't really seem to have any ships associated with it. It seems to be people flying around to do training, which is different to the initial concept of it from 2017, which was a task group deployment. But it was initially announced as a HADAR exercise, I'm pretty sure. And it's very clear from the nature of the activity that they're doing, it's not a HADAR exercise. So I think it does show growth in the relationship. But I think we need to be a little bit careful about being too confident in that relationship. We haven't talked about it, and we don't have time to get into here. But also in the last 2 weeks, we saw Indonesia do an exercise with the Russian Navy. Now, it was a minor exercise with, I think, 2 Russian Navy corvettes, and it's Officer Abaya. I think it's probably the equivalent of a passage exercise, to be honest, for those that are familiar with that term. It's certainly not on the scale of the exercises that Australia does with Indonesia, but sometimes I think we make too much of that relationship. And of course, Indonesia is an incredibly important partner when it comes to Australia's defence and security, but I'm not sure Indonesia always views Australia in the same light.
Yep. They look north, so do we. To the north of Australia is Indonesia, to the north of Indonesia is not Australia. So, yes, I think that is a very fair comment to make.
I'm glad you said that, by the way. I wrote that in an op-ed in The Australian a couple of months ago, and somebody commented, well, that doesn't make any sense. And I'm like, oh.
I could be parroting you back at you, so who knows?
I think that's obvious. Like, geography makes a lot of sense. But anyway,
absolutely, it's the
moving
bones
on.
of strategy, to quote Theodore Roth. Yes, so capability? You've been pushing for the C3000 down select for quite some time, and we've maybe had it.
Well,
who knows?
Who knows? So certainly there's been some reporting in the media that that government have made a decision on the C3000 down select from the 4 or 5 competitors, depending on how you define that, whether you define it by countries or vessels put up. But either way, it was interesting because there was some reporting that came out and said that it was going to be a down select to South Korea and Japan, which is honestly what most people largely expected. And now there's some strong reporting that's come out and said that the National Security Committee has down selected the German option, which is the A200 from TKMS, the MECO design, and the Japanese Megami option. But we haven't actually seen any announcements from the government or defence, and it's not clear when we will see announcements. Some of the reporting said in a couple of weeks, some of it said a couple of months. Of course, there is the complication of Australia must have an election between now and May. I would have thought that this would want to be a decision before the election, given that the timeframe is meant to be the first one being provided in 2029 to Australia and commencing a build in 2026. Realistically, the decision would need to be made certainly early next year, I would suspect, to really make those timeframes. And I think it would be disappointing if the election got in the way of that. What's your take on the reporting about the down select? I think it's important to note this has not been announced by the government or defence. This is just reporting.
Yeah, and that's one of the odd things is that, again, there's been all this reporting, but there's been no denial, no confirmation, which feels a little bit odd. But I must say I was quite surprised. I thought that the Koreans were in with a good shout, particularly Hanwha. I think in some ways I can kind of see why the German option is sort of continues to be quite well liked. I must say, I'm the one that I'm a little bit surprised at, which is the one that seems to get a lot of the attention in much of the discussions, is the idea of going with Japan. With the generally, it sort of seems to be the view that the upgraded Megami class frigate, which I think is clearly an incredibly capable vessel, but so much of the discussion here is about actually getting capability into the water quickly, and this is the one that doesn't actually exist, and the Japanese have no record of building for anyone else. There's a whole host of other challenges which go along with it, and it feels like this is being driven largely by kind of wider strategic desires. Obviously, the relationship with Japan is very close, and I think a lot of people would like to see that sort of closer. But that feels very much in tension with the kind of some of the stated aims of C3000 in terms of getting stuff into the water quickly. So I think there's some interesting things there, and as ever, we kind of have to read the tea leaves and try and work out what's actually going on.
Well, I do. I mean, I don't know. This is purely speculation, but I do wonder if actually the recommendation to the National Security Committee was actually the one from South Korea and the one from Japan, and then they decided the German one would actually go towards the down select. And I do think, look, I don't believe in this no changes. I just don't think that's feasible unless you're going to change your sustainment support. You're going to change some of the missiles that you have in Australia's infantry, which is not something we're about to do, given our focus on Guio at the moment. There's going to have to be some changes. And I think also when you look at the combat systems used by both of them, you would suspect that we will look to try and integrate a SAB combat system or something that we are at least familiar with. So I think that there will have to be some changes. I do wonder if, when I was asked kind of by the media what I thought about it, I thought, well, maybe the approach is actually the down select, including the German option, is actually the de-risked option. Now, it's the subsequent point out to me, there's lots of risk. Yes, there is, but they have successfully produced this for a number of countries. It's not as capable on paper as the Megami class, but it has been successfully exported, with some built in Germany and some actually built in other countries. And I think of the Egypt example, where they built the first 3 for Egypt in Germany, and they have subsequently built one, and they're going to build another 2, but one for Egypt in Egypt. So that's kind of the model that we have been talking about. Of course, though, there has been a lot of conversation about the crewing of the Megami. I do think that we overlook in the conversation a big issue. There's a great piece in Naval News from Alex Luck that I think will the link for in this that kind of breaks some of it down. But I do think we do overlook the VLS issue, the fact that the current Megami does not have Mark 41 VLS integrated. It is fitted for, not with. The future FFM, which will be produced or is meant to be produced by the time we get ours, will integrate it. And there is some talk that they are going to put the VLS into some of the Megamis as well. But I do think people underestimate what it takes to integrate a system like VLS. And granted, it wasn't fitted for not with, but I have vivid memories of the FFG upgrade, the FFG note, and the integration of the VLS. Now, this is a different problem set, and I'm willing to acknowledge it's going to be a lot less risky than that. But I think it is a bit of a complication. There is some risk associated with it.
Absolutely. And I yeah, it's one of these curious ones where C3000, there's more questions than answers in many ways. But we'll have to see. The other huge project which has got some media attention this week obviously has been AUKUS, particularly in light of the US election. And I think you've had exactly what you'd expect. You have some people who say that this is now the time to kind of double down on AUKUS and we need to sort of show the new Trump administration that we're serious. And you're having others saying that we ought to be tearing AUKUS up and running for the hills, largely based on nothing new and the ideas that they brought to the table to begin with. But what's been your take on the varying AUKUS-related discussions coming out of the US election?
I think it must have been a slow news week in Australia because every day there's been an article, something on TV about whether AUKUS is now at an end because of the election of Trump. In fact, I was asked if I'd come on TV and talk about it, and I said, well, there's actually no news. So I have nothing else to say that I've said a number of times before. Look, I think it's just, we've spoken about this before, AUKUS really is being used as a vehicle for others, whether that's ex-prime ministers, ex-foreign ministers, etc., to push a view about Australia's defence and security, which is not actually related to nuclear-powered submarines. It's more about dependence on the alliance. We've seen no statements. I've certainly seen no statements from the president-elect, Trump, or many of the people he's been announcing to support him about AUKUS at this point. And so I think there's no real thing to discuss. We do know that the NDAA passed through the US Congress late last year, said that I think it was 2029, the US president in 2029, which unless the US changes their laws, won't be Donald Trump, will need to endorse the sale of the Virginia class. So look, we'll see. There's certainly no indication that there's any issue with this deal whatsoever.
No, I think that there's probably going to be a fair few or fair bit of head scratching in Russell and in Canberra more generally, and the degree of uncertainty I think is probably higher. But we have to wait and see for what any of this means. We've obviously also heard some interesting names being bandied around in terms of potential appointees or people who Trump would seek to appoint to key positions. But again, A, this is still a long way off, and B, all of these people would still need to be approved by Congress. So lots and lots of hype, lots of hyperventilation, but very little actual news as of yet. In more tangible news, there was also another fire. We talked, I think, last time or the time before about the fire at the BAE shipyard, of which we've heard remarkably little. Certainly I've heard remarkably little about since, perhaps again unsurprisingly. But there's been another fire in Japan.
Yeah, look, I think so it looks like there's been probably the loss of one Japanese sailor, not exactly confirmed at this stage, but a fire did break out early this week on a Japanese mine, the Yukishima mine sweeper. So off the coast of Japan, it was getting ready for a large mine warfare exercise with the US. It looks like it's caught fire with the fire originating in the engine room. There is some imagery online of it quickly engulfing the ship, and the ship has subsequently sunk. Which is sad, and sad to see what is potentially the loss of life of a Japanese sailor. There has been some questions more broadly about the tempo at which the Japanese Navy and Defence Force more broadly have been operating at, and whether that has been the cause of some of the accidents. We won't go into detail, but of course they had some significant loss of life with some helicopter accidents. Recently there was also a Coast Guard plane. And so there is a broader question about this. We don't really know, and I think you can't really speculate except to say that it is sad to see the loss of life of a Japanese sailor. I think it does probably draw our attention back to kind of mine warfare capabilities, though, which certainly in the event of a conflict in the Indo-Pacific would be considered pretty critical. And there's been some recent reporting about some estimates on China's ability to deploy mines in the Taiwan Strait very, very quickly. And of course, mines are actually really, really easy to deploy. And we did see announced in the last, I think, 24 hours that HMAS Gascoyne, which is one of Australia's Huon-class mine hunters, has just entered Sydney Heads for the last time, and they will be decommissioning on the 5th of December. So there is a real question about Australia's mine warfare capability. Now, of course, these are very old ships, the Huon-class mine hunters. There are currently 3 in service, with HMAS Huon having decommissioned earlier this year. I think Gascoyne was commissioned in about 2001, so it's about 23 years old. But once Gascoyne decommissions in December, there will only be 2 left, which is Diamantina and Yarra, which were both commissioned, I think, 2002, 2003, so certainly likely to be decommissioned soon. And we know from the announcement in the Integrated Investment Program, or the subsequent clarification for the Defence Industry Minister in May this year, that the planned replacement will not involve vessels. So it'll be some sort of autonomous capability that is meant to be launched from a vessel of opportunity, which is a term that we hear a lot these days. There's not a lot of vessels of opportunity because not many vessels flagged to Australia. But I think there's a broader theme there about the importance of mine warfare capability, and really a question that hasn't been answered in terms of the future of Australia's mine warfare capability as well.
Yep, and I think, as you say, it's a really important kind of area, one that notably the US doesn't pay huge amounts of attention to, and there's often concern within the US Navy that this is not an area which they kind of really focus on. In fact, one of the few nations around that does pay a lot of attention to this is Japan. So that element of it is quite interesting. I was quite intrigued by your suggestion that these are very old ships. By the standards of the Australian Navy at the moment, commissioning in 2001 it's not that old, but maybe that says more about the RAN currently than anything else.
So, since we did agree to bring back Did You Know at the request of somebody pointed out that we had been neglecting the Did You Know, I think it is very much your turn, Richard, to tell us what you do know.
It is, and this one we decided that we'd do Sydney Emden. So it was the anniversary not that long ago. So 9th of November, and the Sydney Emden is obviously an event which is kind of iconic to a degree in the history of the Royal Australian Navy. This was the first kind of serious engagement, serious action which the RAN undertook during the First World War, and has become sort of a really important kind of touchstone in RAN identity. So this is a engagement between the light cruiser, or the RAN cruiser Sydney, and the German light cruiser Emden. The German ship Emden was originally part of the East Asia Squadron, based out of Qingdao in northeast China, part of Admiral von Spee's larger squadron. Emden was the kind of the newest of the light cruisers, and was sent off on its own kind of independent patrol to attack raid commerce in the Indian Ocean, and did so incredibly effectively. this extraordinary kind of cruise, which in the space of about 2 to 3 months, she sank 25 steamers, famously bombarded oil facilities in Madras, sank a couple of warships, including a Russian cruiser, and ended up having this huge naval presence hunting around the Indian Ocean looking for her. Part of the issue was that she actually then also raised considerable concern about the security of troops moving around Australia, as they're sort of raising troops to be sent as part of kind of the first AIF, so first of Anzac troops, all of which now needed a much more beefed up escort because of the risk posed by Emden. Now this sort of incredible commerce-destroying cruise comes to an end when the German captain, Karl von Muller, decides to attack the cable station at Cocos Islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean. At the same time, the first AIF convoy is sailing from Western Australia across the Indian Ocean towards the Middle East. And this has a very significant escort, notably a very large or large Japanese heavy cruiser, but also Melbourne, so Sydney's sister ship, and Sydney are both attached onto this escort. Now, Melbourne receives the wireless report that Emden is attacking Cocos Islands. It's apparently ever since been a source of frustration that Melbourne was leading the escort and therefore could not go off on her own and has to dispatch Sydney to do so. And so Sydney is sent to investigate this signal, rapidly comes across Emden. Sydney is a much larger ship, faster, more heavily armed and heavily armoured. And so once the engagement starts on relatively early on the 9th of November, it's actually Emden that gets in the first hits, very successful early gunnery, but she only has she's got 4.1-inch guns rather than the 6-inch guns on Sydney. And so the captain of the Sydney, John Glossop, exploits the advantages he has, pulls away, uses his heavier artillery and the range provided by it to basically hit Emden when Emden cannot return. Over the course of the next couple of hours, Sydney's 6-inch guns effectively destroy Emden, and the photographs afterwards of the carnage, effectively, that is created on Emden are pretty sobering, I think it's fair to say. In order to try and save some of his crew, the German captain beaches the ship on North Keeling Island. Sydney then proceeds to capture the merchant ship that had been captured by Emden and was providing sort of coaling and things, and then goes back to support and assist the crew from Emden. In the engagement, Emden loses 134 dead and 65 wounded out of a crew of 316, so pretty horrific kind of casualties. Sydney, by contrast, suffers 4 fatalities, which are from those early hits from Emden, and a dozen wounded. It's a really kind of iconic, as I say, engagement in Australian naval history, and one that then has sort of resonated through and remains a kind of an important, as I say, touch point in the service's identity.
Yeah, and I think that those that aren't familiar with Australia, that might be listening or watching this, in many ways in the Australian Navy, Sydney Emden is kind of celebrated in the same way as Trafalgar Night is celebrated in the UK, where there's normally a mess dinner to commemorate it, normally with German representation as well. The German DA is generally invited, but it is a really important event in Australia's history, and we've just passed another anniversary. That's 110 year
110, yes,
anniversary last weekend. So thank you for that. Did you know?
I think on that note, we've covered all that we can, and so we'll have to once again confirm that, as always, maritime matters, and we'll leave it there and be back again soon to talk more about what's happening in the maritime domain in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. Thanks, Jen.
Thanks, Richard.